If you've ever felt completely lost when you open up the EQ in Davinci Resolve's Fairlight page, or if you've opened it up and just blindly followed along with YouTube tutorials, but you don't really know what you're listening for or what you're actually doing, then this video is for you. Hi, my name's Jay. I am a mixing and mastering engineer, and on this channel, I teach the audio side of Davinci Resolve. So if that is something that you want to learn more about, then stick around. You're going to learn something today. If you like this video, maybe watch another one, like, subscribe, all the things, please. What we're going to be doing today is a deep dive into the EQ on Davinci Resolve's Fairlight page. We're going to look at all the settings, presets, all of the things. My goal is to get you to the point where you know how to listen to your audio so you can figure out what you need to adjust. That way, you're not blindly following along with YouTube tutorials like this one. All right, let's jump into Davinci Resolve. I've already got a piece of footage lined up. This is actually the very first line of the last video I put out, which was on the IntelliTrack feature in the Fairlight page. If you haven't seen that, it's super, super cool. You should watch this, then go watch that because it totally changes the game for sound design. It's amazing. Anyway, we've got dialogue. I've normalized the dialogue. It's the first thing I always do with dialogue. I normalize it to minus 17 dB. And then we're going to go and do some EQ. To find your EQ, go into the mixer. If you don't see your mixer, up here, top right of the Fairlight page, click on mixer. That'll turn your mixer on and off. Then come down and double click on EQ. You'll see we've got a flat curve line. This is a parametric EQ. You can tell because it's got this curve here. Graphic EQs, analog EQs, they don't have this. Parametric EQs have this. So this is a parametric EQ. I'm going to go and reset this by clicking this little circle here. Boom. So let's go through and take a look at the different parts of this EQ before we get into actually learning how to use it. First, up here, top, you saw reset to default settings is this little button right here, this little circle arrow thing. Next to that, we got three dots. If you click on those three dots, you get copy and paste. You can do this to either copy and paste between EQs on different tracks, or you can do it to copy and paste between your A and your B setting. Ooh, look at that. We've got a curve here already. That's because I tried filming this before and I got myself all mixed up and lost because I'm not working with the script and it's a whole thing. Below that, we've got our presets. Normally when you first, let's switch back to A. Normally when you first open up EQ, this says default and you can work from there. But because I played around with this before, because I gave myself a refresher and then attempted to record the video and screwed up and had to start over, it's on dialogue clean high end. If we open up our presets, we've got a whole bunch of stuff here. A lot of these here, all the way down to Music Master Top End Boost. These are all in Davinci Resolve by default. Background music shaping is one that I made. You can see it's just a 1K cut that I use for any background music when I use background music, which isn't very often anymore. Then I've got a couple other presets that I created, JSM57, JSM7B, and then Master EQ. I don't think I created this, but maybe I did. If you're following along in Davinci Resolve, check and see if you have a Master EQ preset. If you do, let me know, because I can't remember if I made this or not. And if I did make it, I don't remember why. Now, you don't have to hit this drop-down box if you want to navigate through your presets. You can do that by clicking these left and right arrows right here. If you start off on our default, and then you make settings and you like the settings and you know you're going to reuse those settings, you can actually create your own preset by pressing this plus button, create new, and then you'll just give it a name and press save and you'll have a preset that you can go back to over and over again. It's pretty cool. Next to our presets, you already saw this, we have A and B. And this is really good for A/B testing. So let's say we do a curve and then we do another curve and we're not sure which curve actually fits our mix better. We can just switch back between A and B and then we can make our decision. It's really, really, really handy actually. In fact, we're probably going to be using that in this tutorial. Below our presets and our A and B, we have the switch to turn our EQ on and off, also known as the bypass switch. To the right of that, we have EQ type. If we hit this drop-down box, for some reason, when I open up my EQ, no matter what project I'm working on, it's default on fire. But if I hit that drop-down box, you see we have earth, air, ice, and fire, which are not very descriptive But if you go into the reference manual in Davinci Resolve and you go down to the section on EQ, you'll actually see that Earth is Fairlight's own just default EQ. Air is an emulation of the SSL 4K EQ, which is one of my favorite analog EQs of all time. Ice is an emulation of the Neve V or the Neve 5. I'm not sure if it's 5 or V, but it's another analog EQ. And then Fire is an emulation of a Focusrite EQ, which is super cool. If you're a music nerd like me, if you've been working in recording studios, if you mix and master music, and then you know of these EQs. Now, they don't do a whole lot. They're not perfect emulations like some third-party plugins, but they do change the shape of your curves a little bit. So we'll play around with this after we create an EQ curve later. Below all that, we have our parametric curve. This is a visual representation of everything that we're doing as we're adjusting our different bands. And if we look on the sides, you'll see this is a graph. On the horizontal axis, we have our frequencies. It goes all the way from 0, which is here, all the way up to 16K and above. If it's like most EQs, this last line here is probably 20K, 20 kilohertz. If we look at the left vertical axis, you can see we've got our dB. So we've got everything from 0 all the way down to minus 80 dB. And if we go to our right vertical axis, we'll see how much we are boosting our frequencies by. There's got plus 10, plus 20, minus 10, minus 20, and everywhere in between. And if we play our audio, hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you'll get a visual representation of the different frequencies in our dialogue. And so if you're looking at it as it's playing, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing. You can see that right around 250 hertz, that frequency is at minus 30 dB. Pretty cool, right? Next to our parametric curve, we have our makeup gain. This is just like the makeup gain in dynamics. If we play around with our EQ, if we play around with our EQ, we are inevitably going to adjust the volume of our audio. And so we can use makeup gain to either boost or cut to make up for that. It is kind of a general rule of thumb in audio editing that whenever you adjust something, you use makeup gain to get back to your original starting point. And that's because one of the first steps in mixing is to create what's called a dry mix. You do your levels before you actually start messing with EQ and reverb and compression and de-essers and all of that. And so once you do start messing around with that stuff and you affect the volume of whatever you're EQing or compressing or whatever, you're going to want to use makeup gain to bring it back. But that's a subject for a different video. Let's move on. Down here below our parametric curve, we have our bands and all of the different settings for our bands. I am going to activate band 1 and band 6, bring band 6 down a little bit. So you'll see we have 6 bands to work with. Now there are different types of curves that we can use for each of these bands. Band 1, if we hit this drop down box right now, it is a low cut, which means it is cutting all the frequencies to the left of this vertical line right here. It's cutting all of this, but we can switch it to a notch curve. And so if we adjust the gain, you'll see got a little notch filter here. Bring that back to 0. We can do a low shelf. And if we boost the frequency, you'll see we got a little shelf happening here. We can even do a high shelf. So if we adjust our gain, it's actually going to boost everything to the right of the frequency, the higher frequencies, but I typically use this as a low cut. But real quick, so here's our frequency knob, and this will adjust which frequency we're actually using. Our gain will raise and lower the volume of the frequencies that we select. And our Q factor, if we bring our Q factor up, it's going to make our notch narrower. If we bring it down, it's going to make it wider. Reset those to their defaults. I typically use band 1 as a low cut. With the low cut filter, you can adjust the harshness of the cut. So if we do a 6 dB cut, 6 decibel cut, it's going to be a very very gradual cut. It's not going to be very harsh at all. 12 dB is going to be a little bit harsher. 18, which is what I typically use on dialogue, is going to be a little bit harsher. And then if you need to be super harsh, you can move it to a 24 dB cut. Some parametric EQs go up to like 32 and it's like straight down. We don't need that really. I don't think I've ever used that. It sounds very unnatural to me. We're going to stick with 18. If we move over to band 2, we've got one more option for curves. We've got our, I believe this is called a peak curve, but this is basically used to completely remove a frequency from our audio. If there's just one single frequency that's giving us a whole bunch of trouble, that's when we'll use this. I rarely ever use a peak filter. I almost always on band 2, 3, 4, and even really 5 use a notch filter. And again, you've got your frequency selection, you've got your gain, you've got your Q factor, but you also have, where we had 6, 12, 18, and 24 for our low cut, we now have low, mid-high, and high. So if we, for some reason, want to switch one of these bands to a different frequency range really quickly, we can drop this up to mid-low and bring it up to mid-high if we want. And you'll see as we switch it around, that number 2 is going around. If we want to go high, we can go even higher. We'll keep this at low for now. Switching this will also switch the available frequencies. So right now, for low, we can go all the way down to 30 dB and all the way up to 399, or all the way down to 30 hertz and all the way up to 399 hertz. If we move it up to high, we can go all the way from 22 kilohertz down to 1.4 kilohertz. And then mid-high, we've got 450 to 8K, and mid-low, 1.5K, all the way down to 100. Basically, this is used, like, let's say you only had a little bit of work to do down in the lows and the mid-lows, but you have a whole bunch to do in like the mid-highs and the highs. You can bring your different bands to those areas so you can do more work. You really only have to worry about that if you're dealing with some seriously screwed up dialogue though. And then if we come all the way over to band 6, we've got the same thing. We've got this time a high cut, so it's cutting all of the frequencies to the right of that vertical line. And then you can choose low shelf, notch curve, or high shelf. And again, 6, 12, 18, and 24 dB cut. Again, typically stick with 18, sometimes go down to 12 to make it sound a little bit more natural. So let's go ahead and reset all of that, and we're gonna go back to an earth EQ. And before we actually go into start listening to this dialogue and start tweaking things, let's go over the process a little bit, because there is a process that I use at least, and a couple rules of thumb, if you will, that you want to follow. First of all, let's talk about the one rule of thumb with EQ that you should always follow, which is cut narrow and boost wide. Let me show you an example. Let's say we are looking for, we did our little, I don't know, low cut here, and now we want to boost our low frequencies to add a little bit of fullness. We're going to boost that using, let's say, a notch curve. We're going to boost it, and we're going to boost it wide. So we're going to widen our Q factor a little bit. Now, why do we want to do that? That is because if we boost an individual frequency or too narrow of a range of frequencies, those frequencies are going to jump out of the mix and it's not going to sound natural. So when we boost, we always want to boost wide, so we're bringing up everything around it. On the other hand, if we need to cut, let's say we're looking for some muddiness and we found some right here, we want to cut, but we want to cut narrow. So we're going to our Q factor a little bit more narrow when we cut. Why is that? That is because we want to cut only the problematic frequencies while leaving the things that we want to hear. So we cut narrow, boost wide. That is a rule of thumb that you should always remember. Okay, now that we know that rule of thumb, we're going to cut narrow, we're going to boost wide. Let's talk about how I at least go through and I figure out what I want to do. Now, there is a cheat sheet available for free that you don't have to sign up for or anything. It's not from me, it's from Blackmagic Design. If you go to the training page on their website, on Blackmagic Design's website, and you get it's a free PDF Fairlight training manual. It is for Davinci Resolve 18, but it will work for this. If you go there and you open up that PDF and you go to page 460, I'll bring it up on the page right now. It's going to give you a little cheat sheet here. It's going to give you 9 different frequency ranges and what boosting and cutting will do to them. So 100 to 300 hertz, if that range is too low, your dialogue's going to sound thin, but if it's too high, you're going to lose clarity. If you look at 200 to 500 hertz, just right is going to sound nice and warm, but too high is going to sound boxy. 250 to 750 hertz is going to be potentially muddy if it's too high. It might even be muddy without any adjustment, so you might want to cut there. That's one of the first things that I cut. 600 to 1.1K, potentially nasal and honky if it's too high, and then you can adjust for intelligibility between 1 and 3, add presence between 3 and 6K, adjust sibilance between 5 and 8, adjust sheen and sparkle between 9 and 15, and adjust breathiness and airiness between 10 and 20. So again, that's page 460 in the Fairlight training manual. It is a free PDF that you can get off the training page of Blackmagic Design's website. I highly suggest you get it, you open it up, and the first couple times you go through and work with your dialogue, have it open so you know what you're looking for. It even has a tip here. A common rule of thumb when adjusting dialogue EQ is to cut, narrow, and boost wide. Also, a little EQ goes a long way, so when possible, make subtle changes, no more than 2 to 3 dB, just as you would when adjusting hue on a color wheel. There you go. A little bit goes a long way. Cut, narrow, boost wide. Remember that, you'll be just fine. Now, let's get that out of the way. Now, personally, I like to cut first. That's just me. I like doing subtractive EQ first, get rid of the things that we don't need, and then we can work on boosting things. It's kind of like color correcting before color grading. You want to make things sound right. You want to get rid of the things that are wrong, and then you can start adding other things to taste. So the first thing I'm going to cut are those low, rumbly sounds that we don't really hear, but if you go into a full mix, those low rumbly sounds start building up as you get more and more tracks in your mix. So you want to get rid of them wherever possible. Dialogue is one of those places. You don't really hear them. They're not really necessary. So we're going to turn on band 1 in our EQ, and we're going to have it at 18 dB, and we're going to listen, and we're going to start cutting, and we're going to drag our frequency wheel until we start hearing it negatively affect the dialogue, and then we're going to back it off a little bit. And then while we're still playing it, we'll do a before and after by deactivating the band and activating it again. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want... Okay. There we go. We've done our low cut filter. We got it at about 107 dB, which is generally, I find myself cutting between 90 and 125 dB. So 107 is pretty typical for me. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to listen for muddiness. Muddiness it takes away from the clarity of your voice. You'll hear it when we start boosting our frequencies and cutting them. You'll hear the difference in clarity in the voice. It's really kind of a hard thing to describe, so we're just going to listen. We're going to use band 3 for that, and we're going to be looking between 250 and 750 hertz. So we'll start right around 250. 249 is good enough. We are going to bring up or bring down the narrow. We're going to increase the narrowness of our Q factor, increase the narrowness of our notch curve, and we're going to start playing. We're going to boost to right around 10 dB, and we're going to play and start sweeping our frequencies. I want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, okay, so we cleaned up some of that muddiness a little bit. It wasn't a huge difference because it wasn't really a muddy dialogue to begin with, but it did clean it up and made it a little bit more clear, a little bit easier to understand what I'm saying. And now we're going to be listening for nasalness, and honkiness. And I was a little bit sick when I recorded that video, so we're probably going to find some. This is going to be between 600 and 1.1K hertz. So we're going to come down to about 600 hertz. We are going to increase the narrowness of our curve using Q factor, and we're going to boost 10 dB. And this time I'm going to do it from down here. I'm going to sweep my frequencies using the frequency knob. You're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Okay, so when I boosted this frequency right here around 977, when we boosted that, there was a little bit of honkiness. You might have heard like a brief little whistle. And so I cut there to get rid of that. So now we've gotten rid of the muddiness, the honkiness, and the low rumble. Let's go ahead and do a before and after of the entire EQ curve so you can hear the difference. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you can tell it's a little bit smoother. It's a little bit more pleasing to the ears because we got rid of some of that harshness and some of that nasaliness and muddiness. And now it's just better. So now that we've done that, it's time to boost, and we boost to taste. What does that mean? Boosting to taste means that we are going to boost the frequencies that we want as much as we want so that it sounds pleasing to our ear and so that it fits the mix. We don't want our dialogue jumping out of the mix so that it sounds unnatural. We want it to sound good to us and to others. There are no set rules for this. There are those recommended frequency ranges in the Fairlight training manual, but there are no rules for this. We are boosting until we think it sounds good. We're going to go from left to right. We're going to start with band 2, and then we're going to work on band 5 and band 6 because we've already done bands 1 and 3 and 4. So band 2, we are going to use a notch curve. We are going to make this a little bit wider, and we're going to boost only about 2 to 3 dB. We'll start at 3, and we're going to start right around 200 hertz. And what we're going to do is we're going to play, and we're going to sweep the frequencies between, 300 hertz or 100 to 300 hertz. We're going to find out where it sounds the best, and we're going to boost and we're going to lower a little bit until we get the right volume, until we sound nice and full without getting any boxiness. You're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear there's that boxiness I was talking about. The results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Boom. There we go. We've got some fullness back in our voice. It sounds nice and deep, sounds radio broadcasty, which is kind of the expected sound when you're using a microphone like this one. If you were using something like a shotgun mic that was up above here and the goal was to sound completely natural, you may not do this boost. This is why I say we are boosting to taste. We are adding to taste. If you think about it like cooking chicken, it's like trimming the fat before you add the seasoning. So let's say, bands 1, bands 3, and bands 4, where we did our cuts, we were trimming the fat off of the chicken. Now we have added fullness. That is our first seasoning with band 2. And now we're going to move over to band 5, where we're going to add presence, which is going to make it a little bit more easier to understand what we're saying. If we have a full mix with sound effects and music and all that stuff, it's going to help us stand out from the mix so people can actually hear us. It's going to just bring a little bit more clarity. And this is usually done between 3 kilohertz and 6 kilohertz. That's what we're going to be boosting. So again, we are going to move over to band 5. We are going to change this to a bell curve. We're going to make it a little bit wider. We'll start at 2 and we'll go wider and narrower as we need. We're going to boost about 3 dB. We're going to move down to 3 kilohertz, and we're going to play and we're going to sweep the frequencies until we find where we want to boost, where it sounds good, and then we'll raise and lower until it sounds good. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, okay, so we've added a little bit of presence. It's a little bit more clear. It sounds a little bit weird with just dialogue by itself, which is why I'm going to bring up my next tip. Unless you are specifically listening for things that you need to take out, so the cutting process, you never want to mix in solo. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you are doing a video where you have, again, sound effects, music, background noise, Foley, all of that stuff, when you are editing your EQ, when you're doing the EQ on your dialogue or on your music or on your sound effects or whatever, you want to be listening to the entire mix, especially when you're in the boosting phase of your dialogue. In fact, I would even say when you are cutting, you should probably listen to the entire mix while you're doing your EQ. Why is that? Well, it's because when you have your dialogue all by itself and you may boost something and it sounds weird when you boost it listening to by itself, but then when you add it into the rest of the mix, it actually sounds perfect. You always want to mix and EQ and do compression in the context of the entire mix. In this case, I don't have an entire mix. I only have dialogue. And one thing that I noticed is when I added the presence, it also accentuated the sibilance, which I don't really like, but we have de-essers for that. And I do like that it made it easier to understand what I was saying. So we're going to keep it. Now comes band 6, and we have a choice for band 6. One of the things we can do is a high cut, and we can cut frequencies, like higher frequencies that we're probably not going to hear, which is usually everything above 13K hertz. We can do that, or we can maybe do a high shelf and add a little bit more airiness and breathiness to our mix. So we're going to do both. This is what A/B testing is for. In this version, we are going to add some airiness and some breathiness, and then we'll switch over to B and we'll do a low cut and we'll switch back and forth and figure out which is better. We're also, once we figure out what we're going to do, we're going to go back and adjust this band 5 and make sure that it's exactly what we want. So breathiness and airiness is usually around 10K hertz and above. So we'll start at 10K hertz. We will boost 4 dB and we'll play and we'll adjust as necessary. You're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, okay, so I like the way that sounds. We're going to move on. We're going to go to B first. Let me show you this. We're on A right here. We're going to hit those 3 dots. We're going to hit copy. We're going to go to B. We're going to hit paste. We now have that curve. All the work that we did before, it's not lost. And now we're going to change band 6 to a high cut filter and go up to about 13K dB. Actually, we're going to go all the way up and we're going to play and we're going to do the same thing that we did with our low cut, but in reverse. We're going to back it off until it starts sounding unnatural, and then we're going to bring it back up again. We're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, Okay, and now we're gonna play around with band 5 again to make sure that that sounds good. You might wanna grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might wanna grab a pair. So just the mere action of switching from a notch filter to a high shelf actually improved the sound of band 5 a lot. And I really, really, really like that. I wonder if we go back to A and we change that. Of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, absolutely, it works much better as a high shelf. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to play and we're going to switch between A and B, and we're going to see really if we need band 6 to add that breathiness or that airiness, or if we want to cut it off. Might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what. So in this case, I actually like it with the low cut a little bit better. I think maybe if this dialogue was in a mix with music and sound effects, I might like the other one. But for this, I think it's perfect, just like this with the high cut filter rather. Now, the last thing we need to do really, well, there's two things we need to do. First, we're going to cycle through these different EQ types and we're going to take a look at how it kind of adjusts the boost and the cut of the curves. It's going to adjust the width of the curves and the shape of the curves. And we're going to listen through and see which one we like. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this. Okay, I actually ended up liking the ice better. It did something in the high ends here. You'll see if we switch between earth, you'll see how it's flat on that 0 dB line, and then it boosts closer up here. If we switch over to ice, you'll see it actually starts that boost a little bit earlier on, and I really like the way the high end sounds using the ice EQ. And now, since all of my videos are done with this microphone at this desk, I know I'm going to use this EQ again, so I can come over here and go plus equalizer preset. Would you like to create a new preset? EQ, and we'll say SM7B desk. Okay. The very last thing we need to do is just adjust our gain if we need to. So if we play, we're going to go ahead and bypass our EQ and we're going to listen to it. And then we're going to turn our EQ on and listen to it again. We're going to be watching our mixer to see if there was really a significant change in the volume. If there was, we're going to adjust our makeup gain just a little bit. This video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might want to grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. Hey, listen, before we get started. Oh yeah, you can see we clipped after we adjusted the EQ. So we're gonna bring this down. Let's try -2 dB. We'll just go back to the beginning. Hey, listen, before we get started with this video, you might wanna grab a pair of headphones or listen on someplace where you have either a stereo or a surround sound setup. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to hear the results of what we're doing today. So there you go. We cut narrow, we boosted wide, we trimmed the fat before we added the seasoning, and now we get to move on to compression and limiting and expanders and gates and dynamics. Guess what? I already did a deep dive into dynamics. You can check that out right here. And until next time, don't forget to go out and make stuff. Thanks for watching.